Okay, I've got 1 o'clock, so we're going to move forward with our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We have with us Michael Miller from ODOT's Division of Finance, who is going to provide fiscal training for LPA subrecipients. As a quick reminder, because of how we are doing this webinar through the broadcast feature, we're not going to be able to take questions from the audience, but we are happy to accept those via email. You can either send them to the LTAP email address, which is ltap@dot.ohio.gov, or Michael will have his contact information on the last slide of the presentation as well. I will send a follow-up email after this presentation with those email addresses on there, and we are going to attempt to record this presentation. If we're successful, we will also be sending a link out to that recording. With that, Michael, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, it's all yours.
Okay. Again, thank you for joining us. We've been working on updates to these topics for the past couple months and are happy to be able to share this information with you today. My name is Michael Miller. I'm with the Division of Finance, Office of External Audits, and I am the new lead auditor for the LPA audit program. I have been in this role since October of 2017. However, I am not new to ODOT or the Office of External Audits. I have been the lead auditor for the MPO and transit audit programs for most of the last 12 months. With my transition as the new lead auditor, and because of comments and feedback from multiple program participants, we are revising our approach to providing financial oversight and monitoring of the LPA audit program. Basically, we are committed to identifying and implementing procedures which reduce administrative burden while still maintaining compliance with federal requirements. The topics for today's session: I'm going to cover a few regulations and definitions, the ODOT LPA agreement, specifically a revised section 15.1, which has cost recovery options for the LPA, and also a revised section 15.2 on federal reporting requirements, a new discussion on effective periods of fringe benefit and indirect cost rates, and then a discussion on revised procedure related to extensions of prior ODOT approved rates. So let's get started. Just to mention a few topics for future webinar sessions. Due to many questions we've had on this subject, we will be updating our guidance on what is needed for adequate documentation of LPA's labor costs on ODOT projects. Also, the process of negotiating fringe benefit and indirect cost rates is not intended to have the same scope as a forensic audit. So we are also planning to update the guidance to LPAs for requesting fringe benefit and indirect cost rates. Other future topics will be announced as we identify problems and develop solutions. So again, before I get into the real meat of the discussion today, I wanted to cover a few sections in the federal regulation and a few definitions which are highly relevant to these subjects. The regulation is contained in Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. It has the title Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. Now in 200.74, we have the definition for a pass-through entity. And a pass-through entity means a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out part of a federal program. For these programs, ODOT is the pass-through entity. The federal program is Highway Planning and Construction, which is identified with CFDA number 20.205. CFDA is the acronym for the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. You'll need that information if you have a single audit and have to prepare a schedule of expenditures of federal awards. Now, the next term I want to bring to your attention is in 200.92, which is the term subaward. A subaward means an award provided by a pass-through entity to a subrecipient for the subrecipient to carry out part of a federal award received by the pass-through entity. When ODOT executes a project agreement, which includes the pass-through of federal funds, it is making a subaward. The next term is subrecipient, which I've mentioned a couple times already. That's found in 200.93. A subrecipient means a non-federal entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity to carry out part of a federal program. The LPA which is receiving this subaward is identified as a subrecipient. Next, found in 200.430, is compensation and personal services. The regulation discusses the allowability of wages and salaries in this section. And again, it is not necessarily limited to wages and salaries, but also has additional discussion in that section. So if you have not read it, you'll want to take a look at it. There's also standards for documentation of personnel expenses. One of the important criteria is that charges to federal awards for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. The next term is found in 200.431, and this is where we find the discussion on the allowability of fringe benefits costs. As stated in the regulation, we expect employee paid leave costs to be consistently classified as fringe benefits and not as salaries and wages. Again, paid leave, we consider that as a fringe benefits cost, not as a direct wage cost. Again, the primary focus should be on consistent treatment based upon documented policies, as shown on this slide. Now, let's get to the discussion of our first agenda topic, the project agreement and the revised options for the recovery of the LPAs, allocable project direct labor, fringe benefits, and/or indirect costs. So there are now 4 cost recovery options, and they've been sorted in ascending order based upon the amount of funds likely to be recovered. Option 1 is now no cost recovery. Option 2 is direct labor plus the 10% de minimis indirect costs. Option 3 is direct labor plus fringe benefits costs calculated with the LPA's ODOT approved fringe benefits rate plus the 10% de minimis indirect costs. And finally, option 4 is direct labor plus the fringe benefits cost calculated using the LPA's approved fringe benefits rate plus indirect costs calculated with the LPA's ODOT approved indirect cost rate. So with option 4, you're switching out the 10% de minimis rate for the LPA's own indirect cost rate. We're going to discuss more details related to each of these options now. So option 1, no cost recovery of the LPA's project direct labor, fringe benefits, or overhead costs. So why would an LPA select this option? Well, A, this option is appropriate for when the LPA does not currently maintain an ODOT-approved, federally compliant time tracking system, and B, the LPA does not intend to have a federally compliant time tracking system developed, implemented, and approved by ODOT prior to the period of performance of this project. And or C, the LPA does not intend to pursue recovery of these project direct labor, fringe benefits, or overhead costs during the period of performance of this project agreement. Basically, there are not sufficient funds in the project budget to cover these costs, and/or recovery of these costs just hasn't been worth the administrative burden. Now, let's take a look at option 2. With the selection of option 2, the LPA is starting to get some level of cost recovery. Direct labor plus indirect costs calculated using the federal 10% de minimis indirect cost rate. The de minimis indirect cost rate is 10% of modified total direct costs, using the acronym MTDC, as stated in subsection 200.414 of the regulation. Also, for those curious persons, modified total direct cost is defined in the regulation in subsection 200.68. Please keep in mind, regardless of whether the LPA subrecipient negotiates overhead rates with ODOT or just uses the 10% de minimis rate, LPAs are required to maintain federally compliant time tracking systems. Accordingly, LPAs are permitted to bill for labor costs and then potentially associated fringe or indirect costs only if the labor costs are accumulated, tracked, and allocated in accordance with compliant systems. Before an LPA is eligible to invoice ODOT for and recover the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate on any project, the LPA's time tracking system and methods for tracking other project costs must be reviewed and approved by ODOT Office of External Audits. Additionally, Nicole Wade in the Office of Local Programs also assists with pre-qualification reviews from time to time. Now, why would an LPA select this option 2? Well, A, this option is appropriate for when the LPA currently maintains or intends to develop and implement prior to the period of performance of this project an ODOT-approved federally compliant time tracking system. And B, the LPA does not currently have and does not intend to negotiate an ODOT-approved fringe benefits rate prior to the period of performance of this project. Basically, there are sufficient funds in the project budget to cover these costs, and the LPA has demonstrated the ability to generate acceptable documentation to support the direct labor costs on ODOT projects. Direct labor plus 10% is sufficient. Further, there was a July 2016 ODOT interoffice communication with a subject line of changes in LPA time tracking requirements that was distributed to the ODOT district LPA managers. It was intended that this IOC was to be shared with the LPA subrecipients. If you have questions regarding this IOC or cannot locate your copy of it, please contact me or LTAP. Now, option 3 has a bit higher administrative burden. However, with this option, the LPA is getting substantially closer to recovering the majority of their costs. So this option 3 is direct labor plus fringe benefits cost calculated using the LPA's ODOT approved fringe benefits rate plus indirect costs calculated using the federal 10% de minimis indirect cost rate. The fringe benefits rate billed to this project must be determined in accordance with the rate agreement periodically negotiated with and approved by the ODOT Office of External Audits. The fiscal period when the LPA's direct labor costs are paid will be matched with the ODOT approved rate for that fiscal year to determine which rate is applicable. Accordingly, the fringe benefits rate applicable to different fiscal years throughout the period of performance of the project may fluctuate to match changes to the ODOT approved rate. So, why would an LPA select this option 3? This option is appropriate for when A, the LPA currently maintains or intends to develop and implement prior to the period of performance of this project an ODOT approved federally compliant time tracking system, and B, the LPA currently has or intends to negotiate an ODOT approved fringe benefits rate prior to the period of performance of this project. Now, option 4 has an even higher administrative burden. However, with this option, the LPA is getting even closer to recovering all of its costs. So, this option 4 is direct labor plus fringe benefits cost calculated using the LPA's ODOT approved fringe benefits rate plus indirect cost calculated using the LPA's ODOT approved indirect cost rate. The fringe benefits and indirect cost rates billed to this project must be determined in accordance with the rate agreement periodically negotiated with and approved by the Office of External Audits. The fiscal period when the LPA's direct labor costs are paid will be matched with the ODOT approved rates for that fiscal year to determine which rates are applicable. Accordingly, the rates applicable to different fiscal years throughout the period of performance of the project may fluctuate to match changes to the ODOT approved rates. So, why would an LPA select this option 4? Well, A, this option is appropriate for when the LPA currently maintains or intends to develop and implement prior to the period of performance of this project an ODOT approved federally compliant time tracking system. And B, the LPA currently has or intends to negotiate an ODOT approved fringe benefits rate prior to the period of performance of this project. And C, instead of using the federal 10% de minimis indirect cost rate, the LPA has or intends to negotiate an ODOT approved indirect cost rate prior to the period of performance of the project. So let's take a look at a simplistic comparison of options 1 through 4. Again, with option 1, the LPA has not received approval to bill labor cost to ODOT projects. Accordingly, in this example, the fringe and indirect costs are both 0 because the base direct labor is also 0. Now, with option 2, the LPA is authorized to bill direct labor costs, but has not negotiated a fringe benefits rate. Accordingly, the indirect costs using the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate are 10% of the base. The base is direct labor of $5,000, resulting in indirect costs of $500 for option 2 in this example. Now with option 3, the LPA is authorized to bill direct labor costs and has negotiated a fringe benefits rate of 65%. Accordingly, the indirect costs using the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate are 10% of the base. Direct labor of $5,000 plus fringe of $3,250. These examples for options 2 and 3 with the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate are very simple and presume there are no other costs to be included in the calculation of modified total direct costs. If other MTDC eligible costs were to be claimed, the amount recovered with the 10% de minimis rate would be a bit higher. Please keep in mind, for these LPA projects, the direct labor and allocable direct labor fringe benefits are typically the majority of costs to be included in calculating MTDC. And again, that's modified total direct costs. Now with option 4, the LPA is authorized to bill direct labor costs and has negotiated both a fringe benefits rate of 65% and an indirect cost rate of 20%. In this example, the base for the indirect cost rate is direct labor plus fringe benefits. Accordingly, the indirect costs using the 20% negotiated indirect cost rate are 20% of the base. Direct labor of $5,000 plus fringe of $3,250, which in this example produces indirect costs of $1,650. Now, let's transition and talk about the revised sections of the project agreement. We're going to talk about the financial reporting and audit requirements. This section of the project agreement should be included in those agreements which include the subaward of federal funds. So One or more phases of this agreement, phases of this agreement include a subaward of federal funds to the LPA. Accordingly, the LPA must comply with the financial reporting and audit requirements of 2 CFR Part 200. As auditors, these sections of the regulation are potentially the most relevant to our area of interest. Subsection 200.302, Financial Management, includes discussion of subjects such as accurate, current, and complete disclosure of the financial results of each federal award or program. And the non-federal entity's financial management system must provide for records that identify adequately the source and application of funds for federally funded activities. These records must contain information pertaining to federal awards, authorizations, obligations, unobligated balances, assets, expenditures, income, and interest, and be supported by source documentation. Further, in subsection 200.303, internal controls, includes discussions such as the non-federal entity must establish and maintain effective internal control over the federal award that provides reasonable assurance that the non-federal entity is managing the federal award in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the federal award. Moving on, in section 200.501 of the regulation is where we find the criteria for which non-federal entities are subject to a single audit. That is, a non-federal entity that expends $750,000 or more during the non-federal entity's fiscal year in federal awards must have a single or program-specific audit conducted for that year in accordance with the provisions of this part. Further, it is not just the federal funds paid directly to the LPA that are included in the definition of federal funds expenditures. Federal and state funds expended to or on behalf of a subrecipient must be recorded in the accounting records of the LPA subrecipient. The LPA is responsible for tracking all project payments throughout the life of the project in order to ensure an accurate schedule of expenditures of federal awards. The acronym is SEIFA, is prepared annually for all applicable federal funds. Applicable federal funds are those that are identified with the various project phases of this agreement as a subaward. Applicable federal funds include not only those LPA project expenditures that ODOT subsequently reimburses with federal funds, but also those federal funds project expenditures that are dispersed directly by ODOT to a third party, like a contractor, upon the request of the LPA. Now, as far as SEIFA preparation, the LPA must separately identify each ODOT PID and/or project and the corresponding expenditures on its SEIFA. LPAs are responsible for ensuring expenditures related to this project are reported when the activity related to the federal award occurs. Further, the LPA may make this determination consistent with subsection 200.502 and its established accounting method to determine expenditures, including accrual, modified accrual, or cash basis. And that section is basically a direct quote from the frequently asked questions of 2 CFR 200. Now, on the subject of SEIFA corrections, gathering data for the SEIFA should be happening consistently throughout the life of the project, not just at the end of the fiscal year. It is important that the SEIFA is accurate. The LPA should have a documented process to ensure consistent, accurate reporting. The funds reported are used to determine major federal programs for single audit testing. When project expenditures are not accurately reported on the SEIFA, the LPA may be required to make corrections to and republish the SEIFA to ensure federal highways, federal funds are accurately reported in the correct fiscal year. An ODOT request for restatement of a previously published SEIFA will be coordinated with the Ohio Auditor of State. Now, this agreement amendments for cost recovery options is new territory for us. We believe it is preferred that each LPA have a more consistent method of cost recovery on ODOT projects. Accordingly, if your agency has multiple projects with ODOT and they do not all have the same method of cost recovery selected, this is not recommended. It unnecessarily complicates the administrative processing and increases the likelihood of errors. So, as applicable, for LPAs with multiple projects in a fiscal year, the Office of Local Programs and Office of External Audits are permitting, actually encouraging, amendments to Section 15.1 of current LPA project agreements to achieve more consistent cost recovery methodology. Increased consistency is intended to relieve administrative burden by standardizing the documentation preparation process of the LPA and subsequently the review process of the ODOT district office. Currently, eligible projects for amendments are those where the PS&E docs, that is the plans, specifications, and estimates, have not been submitted to ODOT central office by the ODOT district. If you have eligible projects that you desire to amend the project agreement, please contact your ODOT district office to initiate the process. Now, we will move forward to the next major topic of our session today, standardizing the effective periods for an LPA's fringe and/or indirect cost rates. +99% of the local governments in Ohio have a fiscal year end which ends on December 31. And the regulation states that the effective period for a non-federal entity's overhead rates should align with the fiscal year of the non-federal entity. So that is what we are doing. We are standardizing the effective period for fringe and indirect rates to match the fiscal year of the LPA. For almost all of you, this means that your rates will be effective for one or more calendar years, that is January through December. Several LPAs currently have ODOT approved rates which don't align with their fiscal year. The Office of External Audits will be contacting each of you with the proposal that we revise the effective period end date to December 31 of the year stated in the approval document. Presuming you agree, which we anticipate you to agree, we will prepare an amended approval to document the change to the effective period end date. This change will get the LPA subrecipients on the correct annual cycle for their overhead rates. Overhead rate is a generic term applied to both fringe rates and indirect cost rates. So let's get into a few more details about this. Also, we are standardizing the annual cycle of this process to align with processes we have been following in other subrecipient grant programs for many years now. Basically, this table attempts to explain this annual cycle. Let's take the second row as an example. The column on the left tells us that the cost data for the fiscal year ending December 31, 2016 is the basis for the rates to be applied by the LPA in 2018, as indicated by the column on the right. The second column from the left tells us that the 2016 cost data should be submitted to the pass-through entity by June 30, 2017. So this gives the LPA 6 months after the end of its fiscal year to gather and prepare the financial documents to support their rate proposal. This also gives the pass-through entity a period of 6 months to review the documentation and negotiate the rates with the subrecipient. For comparison, the second column from the right tells us that the non-federal entity's audited financial statements package is due for submission to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse by September 30, or 9 months after the end of the fiscal year. You should notice a pattern in that the cost data for an odd-numbered year will be the basis for the rates in the subsequent odd-numbered year, and the cost data from an even-numbered year will be the basis for the rates in the subsequent even-numbered year. So odd to odd, even to even. Standard cycle. Now, a few notes related to this procedure. Number one, Ohio LPA subrecipients are authorized to use only the final rate method as defined in Appendix 7 of 2 CFR Part 200. The final rate means an indirect cost rate applicable to a specified past period. In this case, we're taking that forward, which is based on the actual allowable cost of the period. A final audited rate is not subject to adjustment. Number two, all fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates proposed by LPA subrecipients must be based upon audited prior year actual costs. This is basically stating that rates based upon budgeted costs are not acceptable. Number three, all LPA subrecipient fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates approved by ODOT will apply for an initial period of 1 year, which will have direct alignment with the fiscal year of the subrecipient. The benefits of the new process is that aligning the effective period with the fiscal year of the subrecipient provides a logical standard period and is consistent with federal guidance, as found in Appendix 7 to 2 CFR Part 200. Number four, in accordance with subsection 200.414, to relieve administrative burden, the LPA subrecipient may submit a one-time request to extend the effective period for current ODOT approved rates for up to 4 additional fiscal years. So again, this is a one-time extension for a maximum of 4 additional years. Also, once an extension has been approved, the LPA subrecipient is locked in to that rate throughout the duration of the period. A new rate would take effect based upon more current cost data in a future year after the extension expires. Number five, only applicable cognizant federal agency or ODOT approved fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates may be billed to ODOT funded LPA administered projects. We have to acknowledge the chance that an LPA might have its overhead rates approved by a cognizant federal agency. If that approval is actually applicable to the engineer's office, most commonly who our subrecipient is, ODOT would be required to accept those rates. Note number 6, ODOT approved fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates are applied to LPA employee labor costs paid by the LPA during the applicable period of the rate. An ODOT an approved rate applied to costs outside the effective period would produce ineligible costs. This should not occur. Invoices will be monitored by ODOT district staff. Note number 7, unbilled LPA employee labor costs, that is, costs not previously billed to and processed by ODOT, are eligible for retroactive application of ODOT approved fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates. The benefits of the new process. If the Office of External Audits determines appropriate documentation to support the proposed rates was submitted by the LPA subrecipient prior to the labor costs being incurred, again, refer to the sample schedule, then the LPA subrecipient may subsequently bill those labor costs and apply the approved rates, even if the ODOT approval is not received until after the labor was worked. This provision is intended to relieve administrative burden, not encourage late submission of overhead rate request documents from the LPA subrecipient. Also, this retroactive application will likely become a non-issue once the standard submission cycle of overhead rate requests conforms to the new schedule. Now, note number 8, previously billed LPA employee labor costs, that is, costs previously billed to and processed by ODOT, are not eligible for retroactive application of ODOT-approved fringe benefit and/or indirect cost rates. And finally, note number 9, LPA employee labor costs, fringe benefits, and indirect costs billed to and processed by ODOT are not subject to adjustment unless ODOT determines that adjustment is necessary in accordance with federal and/or state laws, regulations, program guidance, administrative rules, or other applicable guidance. And that is it for today's session. We thank you for taking part of your day to join us for this webinar. Should you have questions on the topics covered today, the best way to submit them to me is by email at my email address shown on this slide, michael.miller@dot.ohio.gov.
Michael, thank you so much for your presentation today. And they are also welcome to submit them to the LTAP email inbox, and we'll, of course, forward all those over to you. We do intend to collect all the questions that are submitted, and Michael's going to prepare a written response, and that will be emailed out to everyone who registered for today's webinar. Additionally, Michael had mentioned the IOC during this presentation, and I will make certain that we send a link out to that along with the information on Michael's email address to submit questions for him to respond to. So we appreciate your time, Michael, so much on this webinar today, and we look forward to having Michael present for us again in the future. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance.